Hello and welcome to WITA, and thank you for joining us for today's event looking at the role of the USMCA in great power competition. Today's event is part of WITA's USMCA review series. We plan to continue hosting events on the USMCA review as long as the formal review process takes place. Special thanks to our USMCA review series sponsors, General Motors, the National Association of Manufacturers, Autos Drive America, North American Export Grain Association, and the Corn Refiners Association. Thank you all for sponsoring our series. And next week, as part of the series, we're co-hosting an event in Mexico City, along with the AmCham Mexico and White & Case, exploring the future of the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship. If you or your colleagues are in Mexico City, we hope you'll join WITA International for this special in-person event. Before we get to today's event, a few updates from WITA. First of all, if you haven't already, please subscribe to WITA's Friday Exchange podcast. Each week, we bring you inside the room with former trade negotiators and policy insiders to unpack the latest in trade and tariff developments, what's been announced, what's at stake, and what might come next. New episodes drop every Friday. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, and be the first to know when they go live. We also have a big event coming up in December as we host WITA's first Trade and Technology Summit. That event will be in person in Washington, D.C. and streamed on Zoom. Information on all these events can be found on our website, www.wita.org. As you know, if you've joined us on one of our webinars in the past, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them on screen. So welcome today to Eva Musso with BASF Corp in Canada, Arisa Yoshida at Mitsubishi in Mexico, Rolf Lundberg at Choice Hotels International, and Kevin Hayes at Howard University. Welcome, Ava, Arisa, Rolf, and Kevin, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and you should have received a copy of today's event program by email. That email contains a link to see our panelists' biographies. One final note, as I ask our panelists to please turn on their cameras. As a reminder, what we say today on this webinar is current based on what we know today, November 14th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, but things are changing quickly. So if you're not watching this live, things might have changed. When I came to Washington after grad school, my first job was an intern at the Brookings Institution. Every Friday, they hosted a brown bag lunch with their scholars, and the interns got to listen in from the back row. And one of my favorite things about my job today is that I get to host events like this one, bringing together smart and interesting people to talk about the most important trade and economic issues facing the world. And we're all privileged to listen in, just like I did at Brookings all those years ago. Though today, we're all around a virtual table. So welcome today to our scholars today. Emily Kilcrease, a senior fellow and director of energy, economics, and security at the Center for New American Security and a former deputy assistant U.S. trade representative. Manak, Senior Fellow for International Trade at the Council on Foreign Relations. Derek Scissors, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, Chief Economist of the China Beige Book, and a former member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. And our moderator, Arun Venkatamaran, partner at Covington, former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Global Markets and Director General of the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service, and a former member of WITA's Board of Directors. Arun?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ken, and good morning to everyone. And given the breadth of participation we have, good afternoon and good evening as well. Well, let's get right to it. Let me begin the question for all of our distinguished panelists here, which is, what is the strategic significance of the USMCA? I mean, let me just put a finer point on it here. This, as the title suggests, this is a panel about great power competition, right? So what role or potential role do you all see for the USMCA in the US-China competitive dynamic?
I'm happy to kick us off, Arun. Yeah. And thanks to you and to Ken and our panelists for the conversation. I think we're going to have a fun time today. So let me just start at a high level. Why is USMCA strategically important? And I'd make maybe 3 points here. First, it's strategically important because it's economically significant. And that matters quite a bit when you think about great power competition with China, which has many components that are economic and technological in nature. So if we have an economically significant trade agreement, that matters, right? And so it's worth remembering as we go through the conversation that US, Canada, and Mexico are each other's largest trading partners. USMCA creates a rules-based framework that enables that trade and investment flow, and that the current form of USMCA has really benefited all three countries in terms of their economic growth and prosperity, but particularly it has benefited the United States. So it's strategically significant because it's economically significant. Second, I'd note that it's a gold standard agreement. So when we think about how we want to arrange our trade architecture and our trade relations, USMCA is the most kind of modern form that we have. It did some really interesting stuff on digital trade, on labor enforcement, leveling the playing field. And that's all helpful when we think about the US role in the global economy and our leadership position in how the trade architecture will look moving forward. And then finally, and very specifically with respect to China, I think it was in USMCA where we really started to see specific China-related concerns really come to the fore. Obviously, we started this conversation in TPP, but in USMCA, which actually passed and is a trade agreement that the US is a signatory to, you started to see the conversation much more robustly around rules of origin and things like the US having a say if Canada and Mexico wanted to sign an FTA with non-market economies. Now, we can debate whether those particular decisions were the right ones, but I think when you think about this in the great power competition perspective, you see USMCA as really kind of how we started that conversation within the contours of where we are today.
Excellent. Thank you, Emily. Your thoughts.
Yeah, maybe I can just add in there and to emphasize sort of the economic importance of the USMCA and why that matters. 1/3 of our goods exports go to Canada and Mexico, and they're the top markets for 42 US states, right? So they are vital trading partners, and our trade with them is mutually beneficial as they form key parts of the US industrial base. So if we're thinking about global competition, Canada and Mexico are key components of that. So the economic prosperity that Canada and Mexico have is linked to ours, and we should be concerned about their economic well-being and their political stability as well. Now, if we look at the components of trade with Canada and Mexico, it supports American entrepreneurs. In 2020, the Small Business Administration reported that US companies with fewer than 500 employees made up about 65 to 70% of all identified US companies trading goods with our closest neighbors. So USMCA therefore also supports the very backbone of the US economy and really supports our workforce. When we're thinking about global competition, we have to think about the components of that that are really built up in the foundation of these agreements that really support US economic dynamism.
Excellent. Derek, no conversation about China is complete without you. So what are your thoughts?
Screaming from the back row. I want to give us some numbers for context. 2019, before USMCA goes into effect, to 2024, because this year we have an interruption due to the shutdown. Our exports, goods and services exports to Mexico go up 95 billion. To Canada, they go up 82 billion. To China, they go up 31 billion. Okay, that's pretty good outpacing. The import side is more interesting. Our imports from Mexico climb 166 billion over this period, annual imports. From Canada, they climb 111 billion, and from China, they fall 8 billion. Right? USMCA has redirected trade. Now, there is transshipment through Mexico, which I put at about 40 billion of primarily Chinese goods coming through Mexico in 2024, but that just cuts, that puts China at plus 32 and Mexico at plus 125. We have succeeded in reducing our dependence on China. We have seen this year that Chinese, very conscious Chinese attempts to control supply chains is a threat to the United States. This is a step away from that. It's a step away from dependence on Chinese supply chains. In particular, and I don't want to get into too much detail, but we could use. I'll try to be positive here. We're going to have USMCA. We're going to keep it, and we can specify goods where we have tighter rules of origin that we are concerned about Chinese undermining our supply chains, and then I hope we will look at other goods and say, well, that's not a threat here. Let's have looser rules of origin. So we have an opportunity to take USMCA another step in our competition, particularly in our competition with China. We've already redirected trade to some extent. Now we can be more focused and more strategic.
Thanks, Derek. Let me pick up on something that you mentioned. You spoke particularly to the role of USMCA, which of course is first and foremost a trade agreement. So you did talk about how it supports businesses and entrepreneurs in all three markets. I'd like to dive into that just a little bit and have you explain from your perspective how USMCA uses trade to strengthen the competitiveness of the entire North American platform, and particularly in some of the sectors that we pay, this administration is paying significant attention to, sectors like autos and steel, and even artificial intelligence.
Thank you. And now, if we look at sort of what the USMCA does and gets right, it creates this rules-based framework for us to eliminate our trade frictions, provides a platform for cooperation on many other issues for all the areas that you mentioned, allows us to reduce our regulatory barriers to trade, which has allowed us to have a very integrated auto market. And it's been successful in providing economic benefits to all three countries. We have $3.6 million traded every minute. So North America makes up 13% of global merchandise exports, and we continue to make things together. That's a unique thing about our region, and it's evidenced by the fact that 30% of our exports stay within the region. So our goal going forward should really be to build on these successes, as Derek mentioned, not to create new barriers to growth and innovation. So let me start off by emphasizing that if we're looking at the review provisions in the USMCA, it doesn't mean that we need to renegotiate the agreement. So they're an opportunity to assess what's working, what's not, looking for ways to build on the agreement where possible. And if the agreement isn't working, well, the parties can leave it, but I don't think that that's the case here. We do see that there's immense benefits here, and it's fair to say that the agreement is working well and is intended. Now, I will also say that as with past adaptations of North American cooperation, new initiatives have been layered on top of existing institutions, particularly when there's a need to address a contemporary problem that the agreement may not cover. This is what spurred the Trusted Trader programs during the Bush administration, regulatory cooperation councils during the Obama administration, and we can think about other opportunities that may exist to layer on new initiatives. And I think there's a few things here that we should consider. So first, how do we support our auto supply chains so that they remain competitive? Strengthening the rules of origin in the USMCA last time around didn't really increase production. So is there another way we should be thinking about this? Should we be thinking about rule accumulation with our trusted trading partners like South Korea, Japan, and the EU? Should we be thinking about something else? Can we look for ways to support our semiconductor manufacturing capacity with the help of Canada and Mexico? And how can we leverage our links between industry, government initiatives, and academia to develop our semiconductor supply chain and AI models? Like, we need talent, we need data and energy, and we can do it right here at our doorstep. So we should think about how we can layer that on to the USMCA as well. And then the third thing is, how can we leverage existing supply chain monitoring mechanisms, like for steel, so we can better understand our shared vulnerabilities and address transshipment issues? So there's a way that we can experiment with that here in North America and then scale it up to our trading partners. So I think, thought of in that way, the review is not really a rewriting of the agreement, but a moment of reflection for us to see how we can align our strategic priorities in the areas that we do best, and then think of other areas that we could even do better.
So, you mentioned the importance of the agreement and helping the three countries make things together. And you talked a little bit about accumulation and rules of origin. Tell us a little bit more about the whole point of making things together and why that's valuable. And particularly, help us understand how we can really maximize those strategic gains from North American integration. And how do you do that with an America First overlay on top of it? Or another way to ask this question really is how, or to what extent, is an America First strategy compatible with the North America First strategy?
Well, I would say first, the United States has always sort of had an America First strategy, if we're going to be very honest about it, right? So the approach has changed, though. It used to be that we used a mix of carrots and sticks. Today, it's all sticks and no carrots. So there's a big difference here. And so the way that we're seeing U.S. foreign policy priorities being pursued today, much more unilateral, asymmetric, coercive, these work against U.S. goals. Because when we think about what's made the North American project so successful, has been this lowering of barriers, reducing these frictions, finding ways that we can work together and build things together to remain competitive. The auto industry has survived because of this integration. And I think that shows just how how this has actually been really beneficial. There are other things that we're going to need to have help from Canada and Mexico to really succeed in. So think about AI and semiconductors. If we could bring out that supply chain and build it out in our continent, it actually could be far more successful. Canada has immense energy resources. We can build a lot of talent from all the engineers that are in both these countries as well. And so there are things that we need to think about there which are supportive of American goals and still put America first, but it's America first with our partners. And I think we need to remember that we can't actually achieve some of our goals on our own. And I think it's just an acknowledgement of that that's really critical at this moment.
Excellent. Derek, let me turn to you. Inu's talked about the value of the three partners in North America working together and the benefits that we all get to make 1 + 1 actually equal 3 by doing so. But of course, that also means that we have to make sure that the benefits of USMCA really do accrue to the three North American partners. And so I know you talked a little bit about rules of origin earlier. How can we ensure that the benefits of USMCA really do accrue to those North American partners? And how can we make sure that non-market economies don't take advantage of USMCA and get the benefits of this deal among the three North American countries?
Well, not to be too snide about it, but I think we could start by not opening the administration by attacking Canada and Mexico as the starting launch point of your trade policy. If you want to cooperate more with market economies and less with non-market economies, then maybe you should be nicer to the market economies than the non-market economies. I go back to the point that on the Liberation Day tariffs, Switzerland and Syria were treated the same way, which just seems odd from a number of perspectives. In particular, talking about making things together, I would like to make things together with people that I trust. And Mexico does not have a predatory IP and subsidies policy. It has not created a position where it can manipulate supply chains, neither has Canada. And so we have a strong incentive to move in the direction of working with market economies and possibly democratic countries versus non-market. I think we're doing that already. I think, that's why I gave those figures of the aggregate. The direction of trade is moving in the correctly. We have two problems. One is kind of a general problem, one is a specific problem. The general problem is transshipment, and that defined broadly, it could be, Chinese goods moving through warehouses in other countries and they just get stamped, and it can be Chinese investment. The Chinese investment solution, I think, is very straightforward, that Chinese invested firms based in USMCA do not get national treatment. Simple. People aren't going to like it. Tough. There's a very simple solution. There's some implementation questions which we can help our partners with in terms of who is a Chinese firm. The Chinese try to hide their ownership on occasion. But that's the easy way to do it. You're not blocking Chinese investment, saying China can't invest. China wants to invest in Mexico to create jobs in Mexico. That's fine, but they cannot ship the goods to the United States under national treatment provisions. And the other one would be useful for us. Both of these would be good templates for future trade agreements to win more political support here. But the other, that one to me is very simple and straightforward, and we'll get some people complaining that I don't think their complaints are legitimate. The harder one is designating strategic sectors where rules of origin are tighter. And I take Inu's point that production may not go up. I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned about cutting the Chinese out of the supply chain so they do not have leverage over existing production. I would start with pharma. Some people would start with semiconductors, metals refining. So we have to designate strategic sectors. They can't be 50. If you have 50 strategic sectors, you don't have any. So you're going to designate strategic sectors. There can be an evaluation of how things are going in those sectors built in. And you say in these areas, you can have very little Chinese content or none, depending on how you want to measure it. And then elsewhere, where we're not concerned, I don't see why we couldn't loosen rules of origin. And I don't mean to say that you have 4 strategic sectors and rules of origin are loosened everywhere else, because we have political concerns about autos and steel. But there are strategic concerns, there are political concerns, and there are a bunch of sectors that we're fine with. And we even got this from the administration yesterday when they said, "Oh, coffee, sorry about that. Tariffs don't raise prices on anything, but somehow the prices of your coffee are going to go down when we remove the tariffs." We have sectors that we can loosen rules of origin in, rather than thinking all trade is equal, which the president sometimes seems to do. So that would be the two approaches, which is you do not give Chinese invested firms national treatment, and you have tight rules of origin in sectors you designate as strategic. That way you push non-market economies further out. And I would say, I don't mean to put words in anyone's mouth, but I like the idea of extending this to our other key trade partners. And those rules would also work pretty well with Japan, the UK, and so on.
Thanks, Derek. Let me pick up on what you suggested about Chinese invested firms and restricting their access to the North American market under USMCA rules. But let me turn to Emily on this. Sure, we can impose restrictions that make it harder for Chinese invested firms, let's say in Mexico, to access the US market. But we also know that Mexico, like every country, wants investment and wants the job creation that comes with investment and the economic development that comes with that. How can we support Mexico if we're not going to say sort of help them attract Chinese firms to their market, which there's reasons we might not want to, but how can we then support Mexico, or in fact the whole North American platform, to ensure that there's still investment that is happening and jobs that are created in all markets if we impose restrictions on Chinese invested firms in those markets?
Yeah, I mean, maybe let's right size the problem around Chinese investment. And I very much agree with Derek. I do think we should be using the review to think creatively about essentially denying benefits of the agreement to Chinese invested firms and making sure that they're not undermining kind of the strategic value of USMCA. So I think there's a lot of value in kind of exploring what he said. But to right size the problem, the United States is still by far the largest investor in Mexico, right? So we are talking about this in perspective of, a relatively smaller amount of investment. Not that it's not important, or that in certain cases it might not be a driver of growth that Mexico may be very attracted to, right? So I don't want to diminish that, but let's kind of keep the context in mind. But look, I think there's a couple of ways that you can have a nuanced approach here. And the way I think about the investment question is that we're not, from the US perspective, telling Mexico that you shouldn't have any Chinese investment. What we are saying is that it would be important for the US, and maybe we'll require them to do this, to have the right toolkit in place to address risks that arise from that Chinese investment if it does come into the Mexican market. And so I think there's a range of tools that we would want Mexico to have to enable them to respond to particular situations as they arise. So one obvious one is that it would be quite helpful if Mexico had an investment screening mechanism. Obviously, they are thinking about that. And I think there's a way that we can use the USMCA process to encourage them to actually establish and maintain and carry out their commitment to do an investment screening mechanism. We can talk about whether you put it into the agreement, whether it's a side process, et cetera. But I think that will be an important tool. But then you have to think about how that interplays with some of the tools that Derek mentioned, right? If you do have that Chinese invested enterprise in Mexico, should they be getting the same sort of rules of origin benefits? If we're coming up with a broader investment security coordinated approach within USMCA, and we want to give Mexico, for example, fast track investment screening in the US as part of an overall package, well, I certainly wouldn't want a Chinese invested Mexican enterprise to benefit from that. So I do think there's not going to be a silver bullet on any of this. And the key thing that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about all of these economic security type instruments in the USMCA context is not forcing bans up front or forcing measures to be taken up front. It's really just making sure that both Canada and Mexico have that high level of institutional capacity. They have the right sort of toolkit that can allow for us all to work together to respond to particular scenarios as they arise.
Let me ask all of you, to build on this piece about sort of third countries, let me ask all of you about how we should think about third countries. We've talked a bit about China, Chinese investment in North America. But I think something Derek mentioned earlier suggested that, is there actually a hierarchy here, right? Like, not every third market is China. And is there a way in USMCA for us to distinguish, let's say, Japan or the EU from China with respect to how they are treated within the USMCA context, even while at the same time ensuring that we want the benefits of USMCA to accrue to the North American parties? Do you see scope for having that kind of distinction?
I mean, I'll give this a shot because I have to take. No one may remember this, but it comes up on occasion. I opposed the TPP. I love the idea, and then when I saw the document, I didn't like it. And one of the reasons I didn't like it is because they had watered down the state-owned enterprise provisions so much. I thought this was not offensive in trade liberalization sufficiently to have this agreement. I would say I would love to treat certain countries better in USMCA as a step towards broader agreements with them. And I would start, conservative, because you don't start with 10 and hope it works. You start with a couple that you feel like it is going to work at. To do that, you need strong, for politically in the United States and economically, I would argue, and certainly strategically, you need strong protections against China. Emily just talked about institutional capacity. The Japanese have much better institutional capacity on dealing with the Chinese than we do. Forget the Canadians and the Mexicans. They would raise the standard in USMCA. So I think if you have provisions that say, look, if we're satisfied with your institutional capacity on dealing with our China concerns, as we started to outline here about Chinese invested firms, about supply chains, and so on, we would love to give you better access to the North American market. I don't know that there's support for that politically in the current administration. I think there is in Congress. So I think, opening the door to that, if possible in the review process, maybe just a note, right? Not trying to seal it into this, not holding up USMCA for this expansion. I think that would be a mistake. But opening the door to that is a great idea. And it socializes this notion of, if you have the capacity and the willingness to enforce some limitations on Chinese involvement in your economy, we would like to give you better access to the American market, which is a superior approach to what we have now.
Emily, do you or Amy want to chime in on that?
I agree with that. I mean, I think some of this gets down to specifically which rules are you talking about, and it could get quite technical. But I think Derek's overall vision of, if you have a standards-based approach and you make sure that the rules that you're talking about in USMCA are interoperable with, the ability to foster that same sort of alignment with other partners who meet that a high set of standards, that to me seems like the way forward, recognizing that from a US perspective, USMCA is fairly unique in that it's not purely bilateral, right? Like, we're going to be moving forward through bilateral processes. And so I do think there's a pretty big question about how do you make sure that there's ability to make those by all those bilateral processes kind of interconnect. But one very technical thing that we've been thinking about at CNAS is, how do you draft things like, for example, a denial of benefits provision? Are you saying it's specifically denying benefits to Chinese companies, or are you denying benefits to all non-USMCA parties? That is a very different approach, but I think some of those technical questions actually will have kind of outsized importance when you get to this broader question of, how much are we trying to craft USMCA as a kind of vehicle to facilitate eventually that broader alignment with a broader group of countries that does meet that higher standard, or how much is this just all, only USMCA parties that will benefit?
Thanks, Emily. One of the questions, we're getting a couple of questions from folks that are just wondering, what is the real benefit here for Canada and Mexico to even do USMCA? Like, why should they sign up for this with the way tariffs are being imposed on them willy-nilly, frankly, outside of the USMCA context? And how are we really setting up a competitive platform where, let's build on what you were talking about just now, Emily, let's take the autos context and look at third country markets, like you take Korea and Japan, right? Key partners for us in terms of our automotive industry. But right now, autos from Korea and Japan face lower tariffs than our North American partners, and they don't have to comply with the rules of origin that are under USMCA. So, do you see, like, how are we really prioritizing the North American market, or are there ways that the USMCA might be strengthened beyond just rules of origin to ensure that there is kind of a priority given to the North American market?
I'm happy to start. Everyone will have thoughts on this, right? Because I don't think Canada and Mexico have a choice, right? Like, when you look at the structure of their trading relationships, even if they know that a renewed USMCA is not going to give them the certainty that they want in terms of safety from future US tariffs, including through the 232 process, an outcome in which USMCA is not reviewed is even worse. So I do think that they are in a quite difficult position where I don't see a choice but to move forward with USMCA and try to work through the 232 issues in parallel, which I know is not not giving anyone in Canada or Mexico great comfort. I think the question is, well, what can Canada and Mexico do to make USMCA as a platform more compelling to the United States, right? The economic integration arguments have been made. They don't seem to be winning the day entirely, right? And it doesn't seem like an argument about rules-based trade is winning the day either. That's where, candidly, I come back to this question of, well, are there targeted updates you can make on things like economic security that maybe kind of increase the overall political attractiveness of using USMCA as a platform? You see that the administration is quite interested in this idea. If you look at the agreements that came out from Cambodia and Malaysia, they include economic security in the text of those agreements. Now, I will be clear, they do it in a way that I would not recommend in terms of just saying, thou shalt impose any export control that I tell you to. I think it would be a much better, more durable solution to say, we're going to work together in a more collaborative way to build up the same sort of institutions on economic security and meet the same sort of high standard. And that will enable collaboration on specific matters as they arise. So to be clear, different approaches in terms of what the administration is doing and quite what I would recommend, but they're clearly thinking about this. You saw it in the Western Hemisphere fact sheets that came out, I think, yesterday as well. And so I do think it's worth kind of seizing on this moment of, is there something that we can do as we talk about integration in USMCA that makes clear that it's not just integration for integration's sake, but what we're talking about is secure, reliable, resilient integration? And how do we build that into the conversation? Because I think that would be more directly responsive to some of the concerns we've heard from the administration. And so that's why we keep, at CNAS, we keep coming back to this question of, well, can we think about alignment on export controls and trusted technology programs and investment security, whether it's in the four corners of the agreement or kind of as a side agreement? But I think, you know, that kind of the security and resiliency piece has to be part of the conversation as well.
You know, I know you've been paying a lot of attention also to how the USMCA is playing in Canada and Mexico, and also just recognizing that there's this perception out there that Mexico and Canada really desperately want the USMCA much more than the US, and this administration sees that as a point of leverage to use against Canada and Mexico in these negotiations. What is your take on what's happening in Canada and Mexico with respect to USMCA?
So I would say that both countries really want to preserve USMCA because it's been mutually beneficial, right? Canada and Mexico are definitely more dependent on the United States than the other way around, but they've also always been willing to work with the United States on a range of issues without being coerced to do so. So this idea that we need the USMCA review to force Canada and Mexico to do stuff is kind of bizarre because I think that Canada and Mexico are always willing to talk about things and to figure out ways to align. And in fact, they have been generally aligned on most issues that the United States is concerned about. So I think that using it as leverage is sort of besides the point. Both are aware also that the United States has largely abandoned cooperative approaches and instead embraced some form of its own economic coercion. And I think that's led Canada and Mexico to approach things differently on the domestic context. So the rhetoric at home, for example, if you look at it, you read the newspapers there, it's tougher. You know, they're trying to stand up to President Trump, and it's because the public is paying attention to it. Being bullied publicly by the president does not help the United States cause, and it doesn't go over well at home either. And I think that weakens the people-to-people links across the border. This is why you see, you know, Doug Ford dumping Crown Royal over a podium. You see people not purchasing U.S. whiskey. I mean, these are things that actually affect our economy and our people-to-people links. So really building that foundation of what makes our agreements robust, which is trust, that's being eroded. And I think there's a response to that at home in both Canada and Mexico. Now, both have also shown an interest in diversification strategies, even if those will have limited impacts on their economies. I think is a signal that they're starting to look elsewhere. Now, they're probably not going to shift all the way away from the United States. I think that's economically impossible, but it does point to the fact that the United States now has to consider where there are additional complications in the connections that Canada and Mexico are making with other partners, and we have to be mindful of that. And I would say the bottom line is that this review process is going to be tough if the Trump administration approaches this in a very zero-sum way, and it's going to make it a harder sell domestically in Canada and Mexico, which could lead to a lot more problems that we haven't anticipated. So we have to be really, really careful about that. Let me make one point about the economic security part, and especially how we should be thinking about whether the tools we're using are fit for the job, right? Let's take the 232 tariffs, right? how can we have this cooperation on economic security when we're treating Canada and Mexico as if they are a threat to our economic security? Now, I would argue that in all these areas, in autos, in steel, Canada and Mexico are part of our supply chain. They support this. And I think that we need to think differently about what provisions we need in the USMCA that give a presumption that Canada and Mexico should be exempt from future 232s. I think this is something that really can embed this sense that we are working as North America together in producing a lot of things together and as a bulwark against competition from other places. So I think there's one way that we can do this, and to do it on an evidence-based sort of way, right? So really evaluating what's the threat, where is it coming from, where are the ways that we can strengthen our own domestic supply chains to support all of our three foreign economic policy goals. So I think there are ways to do this, and it's a way that we can also then expand that over to other trusted partners, which I think we should be thinking about really concretely in this negotiation.
Dina, we talked about the alignment and the interests of Canada and Mexico in of course.
Can I just
Oh,
sorry, I have a little bit of disagreement here.
Excellent.
Not in a happy world, but in the world we unfortunately currently exist in. I'm not sure I agree that auto tariffs are higher, the effective auto tariffs are higher. And there's an element of USMCA protection that applies to a chunk of the components, and then the unprotected element, the tariffs are higher. We may get more protection if the court decides that the use of IEPA has been excessive, which would appear to be a logical decision from the economic perspective. I don't know about the legal perspective, but where I disagree a little bit is if you emphasize tariff imposition, you're less likely to get the administration to want to push the review. The president wants freedom on tariffs. Certain people in the administration also want freedom on tariffs. But if you give the president a win, that's not a win, that would be sort of status quo. If you give him a win on auto rules of origin or whatever, so he can say, I'm helping the American auto industry, you can get things like easier two-way investment. There are other areas where the administration isn't so tightly wound because the president may get upset at the agreement. So I'm not advocating this as economically ideal. I'm not even necessarily advocating it as the best negotiation strategy. I'm saying that we're sensitized to the abuse of tariffs, both through IEPA and the 232. If you choose to emphasize tariffs in the review, you may not make any progress. You may jeopardize the review. And there are other issues in which the administration, I think, has more give in ways that the Canadians and the Mexicans would be happy with.
Thanks for that, Derek. Well, I've got you here. Let me drill down further into some of these questions about supply chains, because I think, we've talked about a little bit about the North American platform as, having some integrated sectors and integrated production in a number of areas. But as a number of comments have pointed out, there's a difference between some of that production, but we're forgetting to recognize that so much of that production still relies on inputs from China and other unreliable suppliers. And so how can we use USMCA to not just strengthen production processes across the three markets, but do so in a way that acknowledges their supply chains for those inputs, that really ensures the strength and resiliency of those supply chains going forward?
I think we've touched on this, so I won't spend a lot of time doing it. I do think there's a trust element, and I think if we can get through the review, the trust element rises. And the trust element is to some extent the governments, but it's to more extent the companies. If I feel like, hey, I survived the Trump administration, which immediately attacked Canada and Mexico out of the gate 5 years after the president signed USMCA, maybe there'll be less volatility. Not that we're moving to a perfect trade world, we're not going to do it, or going back to 2014 even, we're not doing that. But if we can get through the administration, we get USMCA renewed, you have people thinking, I can actually run a supply chain within North America and it won't get disrupted. I won't have random shots thrown at me. So that's a step just to get through this review would be a big step, because it's then you have corporations more willing to plan for 5 years out. The second part, I think, would be you have to send a signal of you're going to get preferential access that will overcome the cost differential of using Chinese goods in certain sectors. We're not going to want to do this across the board, and we're doing it in a sense by just having USMCA. But if you want to target more vulnerable supply chains, China has been successful. They're in a lot of supply chains. I would not try to say, okay, every supply chain that China has an important role in, we're going to try to cut them out of. But if you're narrower than that and you say these are priority sectors as agreed to by the three parties, then you can signal to firms again, this is what the US and with Canadian and Mexican assent at least wants you to emphasize in leaving China. We're helped by the fact that there's disinvestment by US firms from China the last 3 years. So we have a sentiment change in the US business industry, way too late, but it has happened, where if you give them a signal of we're going to stick with USMCA and North America as a base, and we're going to emphasize these sectors in particular, that's how you get firms cutting the Chinese out despite the cost differential.
And Emily or Ina, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm thinking about this as Derek was talking. I was thinking about how we could ground this maybe in a specific example in a specific supply chain that I think we would all agree is important. And so I was thinking about AI and particularly kind of the US priority moving forward on building out AI data center infrastructure. And there's clearly a role for Canada and Mexico, I think, in that. Now, clearly, the US is the dominant player there in terms of the design of advanced chips and the frontier lab capabilities. But Mexico has a really important role there, right? They are, they are assembling AI data center servers. Canada can play a really important role there as well in terms of just they're cold and they have a lot of energy. So it could be great to build some data centers up there, is what we keep hearing from the Canadians, right? So there's an approach there that's kind of North American AI tech stack, even if it's clearly dominated by US capabilities. But when you think about how that applies in the USMCA context, like just openness and integration is not going to cut it there when you're talking about some of our most sensitive and strategic supply chains. And I'm saying strategic really from a national security perspective there. And so as we think about kind of how do you get that balance of openness and integration with security and resiliency, it's hard for me to see how you get there without making sure, again, that we have those high standards on, is Mexico, does it have a robust export control regime? So if it's getting NVIDIA chips in Mexico to then export back to the United States for a data center infrastructure build out, we have confidence that those chips aren't being diverted. Do they have a trusted tech program like the Commerce Department ICTS program, so that if they're importing components to, again, put into those servers to come into the United States, that we can trust that product? And so I do think, I look at USMCA as an opportunity to raise the bar and raise the standards, not as we need to coerce the other countries to do this, to Ainu's point, like I think one could do this in a more cooperative way. But if you think of USMCA as kind of the gold standard of how we want to structure our supply chains, and then you apply that to some of these very strategic supply chains, I have a hard time seeing how you get there without integrating some of these high standard kind of economic security programs as well.
Derek, let me follow up on that with you. Emily has been particularly articulate, and kudos to her and CNAS for some of the great work they've done and the papers they've published on this. We've been kind of talking about the role of economic security, including provisions in USMCA that address some of these economic security elements. And I want to pressure test some of the assumptions underlying that, because we've been talking about it, but maybe we need to go back to first principles, because some of these things that we're talking about are just so different from what we traditionally thought of as being in trade agreements, at least certainly trade agreements of the past. Is it self-evident, or does it make sense to really update our approach and incorporate these types of economic security priorities explicitly in trade agreement negotiations? Or should trade agreements be focused first and foremost on what traditional trade agreements were focused on as priorities?
I think I don't even agree with I know everyone makes it. I'm not disagreeing with you in particular. I'm not sure that I agree with the characterization of what trade agreements were originally focused on. I mean, let's start the evolution of the global trading system starts fairly early on with, of course, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact are not involved. Right? We're not thinking about that. We don't have to craft economic security provisions. So I don't know that we're really, when people say, oh, I want to go back to the era of free trade, I mean, I want to say the era of free trade lasted about 15 years, because we were not trying to create a globally accessible, trade pattern in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. So just instead of implicitly saying, of course our enemies can't participate, of course communist China in 1968 cannot participate in any rounds of agreements that we're negotiating, we now have to do this explicitly. So I don't think the principles have changed. I think we are all aware and Emily's touched on this when she's talking about specific examples, we just have to do more work in these agreements. We have to lay this out and say we're not trying to make this universally accessible. We're not trying to make it global. We have restrictions that we have to make. And then there's the stuff that everybody knows. We've created more complex supply chains. There's much more investment volume than there was. So I don't know that the principles of trade agreements have changed. I think the applications have changed because we now have to say a bunch of things and govern a bunch of processes that we just took for granted as either being, everyone understood the situation or they weren't important before. I just, I want to give a little bit of a tiny little bit of an example. Everyone knows the U.S. industrial base has narrowed, and the part I'm most concerned about of many, but at the top of the pyramid is fine chemicals. We didn't have to think about this before when we were making trade agreements. Like, oh no, we can't make our own fine chemicals, so our whole pharmaceutical industry can be brought to a halt. It wasn't like in the 60s we said we don't care about that. It wasn't an issue. And just to give a USMCA example, I don't know, to be blunt about my ignorance, what the environment is in Canada and Mexico, but I feel like the not in my backyard, and especially the litigation aspect, has to be better than the United States, because who could be worse than the United States? And so that starting up fine chemical production, which has barriers in all countries, would at least be safe from nuisance lawsuits, and that would be, according to the fine chemical makers I talk about, a big help. And so, the principles I don't think have changed that much. It's the situation has changed, and fine chemicals are an example. We didn't think about we have to cut hostile foreign suppliers out of the fine chemical supply chain here, because why would we? But if we went back to the golden age of free trade and said, here's the situation, I think we would find a lot of our trade negotiators saying, well, what do you mean that they can actually block? There's no comparative advantage here when a country can block production. We're not supposed to be facing that. We're supposed to be accentuating production advantages, not having countries able to block production. So I think we would have incorporated most of these issues if they were salient, at least for the first 25 years of the trade expansion. And in particular, there are steps to take where you don't want to be in a position where trade means that another country can deny you the consumer goods or the intermediate goods that you need to keep your economy functioning. That's not a goal of integration and specialization.
I'd welcome your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, a few points I'd like to raise here. I mean, one thing, I think this claim that there ever was a golden age of free trade is incorrect, right? Like, trade has always been strategic. I think that's certainly we've seen this embedded in everything from the GATT onwards, and in all the bilateral deals that grew up as we had all these regional efforts spring up in response to the fact that we couldn't deal with things in the multilateral system, and that some countries wanted more deepening and more restrictions around access to their markets. So I think that strategically thinking about trade has always been there, and it's nothing new. I think what's new today is the fact that U.S. power is different, and we live in a much more multipolar world where we have other concerns that we want to deal with. And because of that, we're trying to figure out how to do that. And this is why we have this economic security narrative that's growing up as a way to try to reframe things that we've already tried to think about for many, many decades, right? So we're just creating this frame here. And I think one thing that we have to be really careful about is the fact that we're taking a lot of measures right now. And we're embedding new rules in trade agreements, potentially, as we've seen with Malaysia, Cambodia, and others, that say this is all for economic security. Well, I just want to point out that the United States does not have a coherent economic security strategy at the moment. And there's a blurring of concepts between what's national security and what's economic security. And I hear people throw these out all the time as if they're interchangeable. They are not interchangeable. And I think we need to think very carefully about what exactly the threats are, what are the appropriate tools to tackle them, and then who are the partners we need to work with. So I think being very concrete about this is important. So we hear a lot about, we need to deal with non-market economies. What are all these non-market economies that we're dealing with? Or is it just China? If it's just China, let's just say it's China and deal with that. So I think we have to be very clear about what the problem is and how we're going to handle it. And we cannot do it if we're just going to throw in provisions that say, you shall do all these things and there's no way for us to enforce it. that is not an actual sound way to go about doing any of this. So I think we have to kind of step back and say, okay, what are our goals here? How are some concrete ways that we can achieve them, whether it's creating some sort of early warning system to work with our partners to figure out when we have supply chain vulnerabilities. Transshipment monitoring is something we can work on. Figure out how we can develop best practices, as Emily mentioned, when it comes to investment screening. These are concrete things, but we need to work on those issues and not talk about this as some sort of big sea change and paradigm shift in US thinking, because it's not.
Can I just ask, I completely agree with everything you said, but I have a practical question. I have been trying to get the US government in my tiny little way to decide on a set of strategic sectors for the sake of corporate planning for 10 years, failed. Those goals that you're talking about in terms of defining a US economic security strategy, great goals. I might respectfully suggest that we should not try to do that in this review process. Like, it's just, I'm not sure we're capable of it. I think it could end up, delaying or blowing up the review process, so that what you're talking about is relevant to USMCA, absolutely, and it's relevant to the review process. And yet I feel, as a matter of practicality, that, like, okay, don't listen to her. She's right, but don't listen to her. Just get through the agreement and sign and renew it, and then we'll talk about those issues. And I'm wondering if you think, no, that, Derek, you're wrong, we need to do this now, or what's your view of legitimate issues and the practicality of the USMCA renewal?
Well, fair point, Derek. And I think that one thing we need to think about here is that there are two parallel things that are going on here. And I think the administration is trying to do too many things all at once and not doing them all very well because of that, right? And so if we're talking about the USMCA review, I think, yes, we should focus on looking at the agreement and what's in it and whether or not we need to improve certain aspects of it. That doesn't mean we should load it with all these new things that are shiny and interesting to the administration to toss in there. So I don't think we should be embedding all these new sort of economic security tools in the USMCA. We should leave that aside as a separate conversation. That should not be embedded in the agreement at all. What we need to do is think about how we preserve the USMCA as it is, because it is working. And in fact, the administration knows that it's working. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a lower applied tariff rate on Canada and Mexico compared to what they announced as the IEEPA tariff. So I think they understand that the tariffs actually don't help. So I think what we need to do is to have in the United States a broader perspective on what it is that we want to do in terms of economic security. And there's a way to do it. We've had several reports that have been coming out for many years thinking about how we can make economic security a concept that we can operationalize. Other countries have already done this. Japan has a very well-developed economic security strategy. The European Union is developing its doctrine right now. It's going to be released probably in the next few months. Like, there are ways that we should be talking to our allies about this, and we're not doing that. And so I think we need to kind of step back before we start saying, okay, add this provision here, add this provision there. Why are we doing it, right? And so maybe there's a few things that we could do in USMCA that are related to economic security, but I do worry if we put these in the agreement, we may end up creating some additional obstacles that we did not intend to put in there down the line. So I'm just saying that we should be really cautious about what we think this agreement can actually do in this short time period that we're doing this renegotiation.
Thanks, everyone. We spent about an hour talking about the renegotiation of a key trade agreement, and not once has the word Congress been uttered in this hour. For some of us that work on trade agreements, it's a little bit surprising. Derek, what do you think about where Congress is and where it should be, and what can we expect their role to be going forward on the USMCA?
Let the transcript show that I did say the word Congress right at the beginning, saying that I thought Congress would actually support trade expansion under certain conditions. And I think that's I'm gonna keep my answer brief because I know Emily wanted to say something. I think Congress has, because it's a Republican-controlled Congress and they have decided for whatever reason to greenlight everything the president wants to do, I don't think we can count on Congress to get in the president's way. But I think of Congress in a split Congress, as we move later in the Trump administration, I think Congress's inclinations are they would like to build up U.S. trade with countries that they approve of. Now, the countries that they approve of is an issue. The sectors they think sensitive is an issue. But I think in general, Congress passed USMCA not long ago and easily. It wants to pass USMCA. It doesn't want President Trump to turn this into, including the Republican majority. I feel confident of this. Not all Republicans, of course, and not all Democrats. They don't want the president to turn this into some sort of litmus test. They would like, as often is the case with Congress, that trade moves forward quietly and they are not put on the spot. And so I think, if the USMCA review could move smoothly from the administration, the Congress absolutely would not get in the way. It would breathe a sigh of relief, and some members would actually cheer. I think going beyond that, Congress would like to have a role, say in 2028 or 2029, where it directs the expansion of U.S. trade agreements, which has been off the table because of various things, legitimate and illegitimate. And the expansion, I don't think would be as aggressive. I really don't think it would be as aggressive as TPP, which would not pass even now. It would be, maybe on the, as Emily was saying earlier, on a bilateral basis. But I think if you narrow trade to something that's more bite-sized for the Congress, I think you have more support for trade liberalization in the Congress than you have in the administration, and that support will come out a few years from now. I don't want to be too optimistic and say next year we're going to see an activist Congress on trade. We're not. But I think as the Trump effect fades, Congress will first be relieved if we can get through USMCA and then think, hey, we have other partners that are really important to us, like Canada and Mexico.
Thanks, Derek. Let me, we're at the end of our time, and I'm going to do a little lightning round here with a completely unfair question, since we only have about a minute left for each of you. But I think it's an important question for us to think about, and that is really to what extent do you all think that the USMCA can or should serve as a template for new trade agreements going forward? And particularly as we think about the role of trade agreements in advancing strategic objectives. Does it make sense for us to take USMCA and replicate it with other regions, or is there something about USMCA that is unique to North American integration that makes it a bit sui generis compared to how we approach our strategic interests with the rest of the world? Let me start with Emily.
I think it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, right? Like, I think to the extent that there's good disciplines that are and high standards that are negotiated in USMCA, I think we should absolutely look to replicate those around the world. You can look to, for example, the digital trade chapter in the first USMCA. I think that's a good template. But a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today is going to be really specific to the context of how North American supply chains are structured and the particular challenges that we're grappling with in the North America context. So I don't know that I would say, well, wherever we land on rules of origin is exactly what we should do with Vietnam. I'm not sure that makes sense. But I do think, as we think about these new constructs and lessons learned, we should take those lessons learned, just recognizing that how we apply them specifically, the exact numbers you land on, for example, really do need to be kind of specific to the partner that you're dealing with.
Derek?
I think I would go back to what I was trying to say when I asked Ina that question. I want to get through the USMCA review, and I think it's a valuable agreement with the United States. Yes, I have improvements I want, but I would sacrifice those improvements right now if President Trump said, "I'll sign the renewal." Let's go. Let's get through the USMCA review first, because it's a huge problem for us if there's an extended disruption. Beyond that, there's a difference between every country in the world other than U.S. and Canada and Mexico, because they're long land borders, and that changes the trade relationship, and it changes a lot of issues in the trade relationship. But I do think we can use what we either are going to change USMCA, the ways in which we're going to change USMCA, or the ways we would like to change USMCA if we had more time and it was a less fraught process, to think about, okay, with these changes, with these, what I would care about most, guardrails against Chinese manipulation of supply chains, who else can come on board? And if we do that satisfactorily, I think it's a lot easier to look at other countries and say, okay, if you can meet these standards, then we're a lot happier to trade with you and make an agreement with you than we would be in the world of 5 years earlier. So I think get USMCA done, but think about what an improved USMCA with regard to China would mean for other countries. I think that works.
Bring us home.
Yeah, so I guess the question we need to ask is whether trade agreements being put forward today can offer any lasting framework for trade with the United States, Are these just executive agreements that will be abandoned when the Trump administration ends, like the IPEF was under the Biden administration? Or is Congress going to put their stamp on them and make them part of domestic law? If they can be made into something permanent, then yes, I think the innovations in USMCA are a template that can be incorporated into other agreements. But if we are moving towards pure asymmetry in foreign economic policy with a temporary trade deal that will disappear at the end of the administration, I just don't see any space for any rules-based framework in the future.
Thank you. Don't mean to cut everybody off. This is terrific conversation. We're so blessed to have the four of you join us today. Really grateful. Great conversation. Everyone out there, we had a ton of questions. Kudos to Arun for weaving in a lot of the themes in those questions. We didn't get to all of them. We are going to be able to download them, though, and I will share them with the speakers separately by email so that they can see those as well and who asked them. So thank you for those of you who participated online. Thank you to our speakers. Really grateful to have you. Thanks as well to our USMCA review series sponsors. I mentioned them again: General Motors, the National Association of Manufacturers, Autos Drive America, North American Export Grain Association, and the Corn Refiners Association. Now, they all care about the USMCA review same way you all do on this Zoom. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Inu. Thank you, Arun. Truly grateful to you, and look forward to seeing everybody else on our